So, a little over a week ago, I did a video analyzing a couple of interviews with Johnny Depp, and that video was very well received. A number of you liked it and thought that I brought up some new and interesting stuff. And so I wanted to do the same thing with AH. It's been a while since I've done a video on her. And so I wanted to dig around and see if I could find anything new. Now, I do have a long analysis video where I look at different interviews that she's done, different and show video clips from it, and that remains my most popular video so far. So if you haven't seen that, if you haven't seen part one to this video, then take a look at that. But I did come up with a couple of articles that I think are really, really interesting. And I think that probably a number of you have not seen these, have not read these, because they have been paywalled. And so in 2019, there was a writer named, and it's an interesting name, but her name is Leif Arbuthnot, and a British writer, and she interviewed AH in 2019 and apparently spent like a whole day with her, and wrote this article. And then she wrote a follow-up this past year during the UK trial, again talking about AH and her experiences with her. Now, what I had to sign up for a free trial. These were in the Times, and the Times is like I believe Britain's most venerable and respectable publication. It's the one that the royal family likes to read, apparently. But these articles were in the Times, and the Times has been paywalled for a long time. So I had to sign up for a free trial. So I signed up for the trial, so you didn't have to. But I'm going to, once I actually got into these articles, I was really amazed at how these two articles sound very different. The tone is very different from what you normally get in articles about AH. I would say almost every article that I've read about it's generally very fawning, and wow, this woman is amazing, and oh, what she's been through with Johnny Depp and so forth. And these two articles are very different. The tone is very skeptical of AH in general, and at times says some pretty sort of insinuating or cutting things in a kind of a British way. So I thought you would find these amusing, because I found them really amusing, and I did pick up some new things here. But I wanted to read through them some and share with you, discuss what I think are some of the more interesting things. The title is The Interview, Actress AH on the Fallout from Her Marriage to Johnny Depp and Female Empowerment. Now, understand that basically this writer with the unusual name, Leaf, this writer, who she'll talk about herself a bit later as being a very buttoned up British person, so kind of like the stereotype that some of us have about the British stiff upper lip and being sort of very like skeptical, especially of big displays of emotion. I'm not saying that this is like true or not. I'm just saying that this is basically how this writer is going to describe herself. So just to kind of set the scene, is you have this really sort of buttoned up, unemotional British writer who has this assignment to hang out with AH all day and talk to her when she can and write about it. And so half of this article is going to be just quotes from the interview, quotes from AH. And then the other half will be some of the writer's observations about her, which I think are interesting and honest. All right, so getting into this, it says, AH is gripping my hand, her eyes full of tears. We are in an old-fashioned hotel in The Hague, Netherlands, and the American actress is remembering the Supreme Court hearings in September. And of course, I'm not going to get into that, but it was very much of a kind of a big story in the political world and so on. So AH is going to start this article by talking about this. So AH says, quote, every single woman I know watching that hearing was triggered, says AH. She is one of those people who looks madly beautiful even when they are crying. All right, so the interviewer is very clear on the fact that she's beautiful, right? Quote, I don't know a single woman who watched those hearings and didn't have their heart break. We are all Dr. Ford, and we know it. I'm not so sure. This is Leaf talking now, or writing, okay? And Leaf is writing, I'm not so sure of what she's saying. But AH continues undeterred. Quote, I'm sorry if watching that hurt you. She's talking about the Supreme Court hearings. I'm sorry if watching the hearing hurt you, she continues, staring into my eyes. But I feel you. I feel you. I think the good news is we all feel you. You know, we're all your sisters. Now, you have to, again, understand the kind of amusing setup of this, because what the writer is going to say a little bit later is that it's very obvious that AH is really trying to ingratiate herself with her and really have this emotional connection with her. And so she assumes that this writer must have been really upset by the Supreme Court hearings and must share, her sense of consternation and everything. And so she's trying to build this like political feeling of like sisterhood. And the writer's response is merely to say to us, I'm not so sure. And so right off the bat, it's kind of interesting that you have this writer who's kind of like, okay. Now, the writer is going to step back here, and the writer is going to give us a brief synopsis. I'm not going to read it, of basically AH's recent history and Johnny Depp and all of that. And basically just report things as they've been reported in the media. And so there's not a real significant sense of skepticism that the writer seems to have toward AH's story about Johnny Depp, but she does, like I said, seem to have an overall skepticism about AH as she's experiencing her in this interview. And so then after she asks, the writer asks AH, did watching that Supreme Court testimony, did that revive memories of the negative things that you've been through? And AH says, the results of difficult situations like that are sneaky. They're not as obvious as you think. I don't hide under a table when I hear a loud bang, though that does happen to certain people who've been through what I've been through. It sneaks up on you in weird ways, where all of a sudden you find yourself in a puddle on the floor, crying while watching this play out live on Fox or CNN. And you wonder why you care so much. It's not your situation, right? But it is. It is. So what she's saying basically is that when she was watching these the Supreme Court hearings and the testimony, that she was reduced to crying on the floor in a puddle, that it just completely shattered her emotionally, because, and partly because it resonated with what she claims that she's been through. Okay. And then the writer, Leaf, is going to talk a bit about the article that Johnny Depp gave to GQ magazine, in which he refuted AH's claims. And then she's going to go back then to ask AH, is there anything that your younger self wishes that you'd known? So she asked AH, is there anything that, mistakes that you made, or anything that you wish you could tell your younger self? And AH replies, I cannot possibly have appreciated how deep and how strong the systems that oppress women and marginalized groups are, she says. I still to this day believe the truth is the only thing that's sustainable. I just didn't realize how much it would hurt getting there. I don't know where that finish line is, but I fight every single day, and every single day it gets better. And every single woman that comes up to me and says thank you reminds me of my instinct to believe that right always wins, ultimately. That a lie is not sustainable, injustice is not sustainable, that there's a right side of history and a trend toward progress. Okay, so again, the writer is trying to get her subject here, AH, to talk about her own personal experiences, and instead she's giving her this really long-winded speech, like she often does, about politics and injustice and stuff like that. All right, and now the writer is going to step back again and give us more context here. She writes, we are in the right place for this kind of woke chat. Now, I like how she calls it a woke chat, because it's completely dismissive of everything that AH has just said to her, right? Because AH has just given her, like I said, this really long-winded political speech here and is really trying to impress her and keeps seeming like she's missing the mark, apparently. And so after she gives this really long-winded speech about injustice and all of this, the writer's only real thought or response is to say, that's a woke chat. I mean, she doesn't literally say it to AH, but she says it to the reader, okay? We are in the right place for this kind of woke chat. AH has flown to The Hague to speak, and The Hague, so this is part of what she does with as a UN ambassador, and we've talked about that. She is a UN ambassador, and so does all of this, is able to do all of this cool and media-worthy humanitarian work and such. We are in the right place for this kind of woke chat. She has flown to The Hague to speak at One Young World, a yearly summit that brings together bright young people from around the globe, empowering them to make lasting connections to create positive change. The launch event the previous evening in front of the historic Peace Palace had the fervor of an Olympic opening ceremony with energetic flag waving and inspirational speeches. Gordon Brown, Sir John Major, and a former Nobel Peace Prize winner are all here. AH's main commitment is a speech on migrant rights on the U.S.-Mexico border. All right, so AH is there to participate in all of these different prestigious humanitarian events at the UN, and also to talk about migrant rights. Now, I really like this part. This next paragraph is where the writer, Leaf, is going to give us more of her own personal thoughts on AH as she has seen her so far. She writes, "Some stars disappoint in the flesh. Not her. She is luminous, like shining, basically. She is luminous and magnetic, with a croaky, starlit voice straight from central casting." Now, at this point, some of you may be thinking, wait a minute, I thought you told me this was going to be a negative article, but I really appreciate that the writer is just giving us her honest impression, which is that, wow, this woman is beautiful and luminous and shining. But then as the article goes on, she's going to mention some other things, okay, like this propensity to give these woke speeches. Okay, so she writes, "She settles her tiny frame onto the sofa and tells me she has Band-Aids on her chest. This is not a metaphor for her bruised heart. She really is wearing plasters over her. British Airways," she explains, "lost her suitcase on the way over, leaving her braless. In the absence of a fresh change of clothes, she is wearing a knitted jumper and skirt that would make anyone else look frumpy." And so they talk a little bit about traveling, and then the writer writes, "AH was raised in Texas, about 40 miles from the state capital." And AH then talks about Austin a little bit, and so forth, okay? And then the writer talks about some of her different credits and what's going on with London Fields and the lawsuit and everything. Okay, now we get to the writers discussing how AH met Johnny Depp, and now they're back to talking about the present. Okay, now the writer also writes, "Even when she is sitting still, she gives the impression of someone who is flitting from thing to thing, moving as quickly as possible to avoid silence and her own company." I like that. That is very insightful because, we've talked about this before. Those of us who have analyzed AH, and you see it in my prior video where I spent, like almost 2 hours breaking down different videos and interviews. But this is the woman's impression. She said that she's just kind of flits, like almost nervously from thing to thing, just bouncing around. And that this woman's observation is that she's doing it to avoid silence and her own company. So this woman is able to key into the fact, as a number of you have, that beneath the seeming veneer of confidence and of intellectualism or whatever, the appearance of it, that there is this real, not only insecurity, but this kind of unsteadiness or indeterminacy that we find in people who are like AH. And I talked more about that in my previous video. AH says, quote, "I have a hyperactive mind that is allergic to boredom and has high standards for stimulation. The antidote to anxiety is action. The busier you are, the less you have the ability to succumb to it. The writer then asks AH if she's happy. Yes, yes, she says, giving me a dreamy smile I don't quite believe. The writer then asks, is she in love? Quote, I'm in love with life and doing that which truly gives me love back, which is people. The writer says, for now, though, AH needs caffeine. We stop talking to allow her to order a croissant and an iced coffee. She nibbles half of the pastry, assuring me she is, quote, unstoppable at a buffet. Now, this is kind of interesting. Again, one of the, I think, the joys of reading an interview is finding all of the little things that you quickly pass over if you're just reading fast or skimming it, and just little moments where we get a sense of what the writer is thinking and maybe doesn't want to come out and say. So what the writer is telling us here is that AH orders a croissant and a coffee, and she like barely nibbles on the pastry, and basically is not really eating. Okay, but then she tells the woman that she's, quote, unstoppable at a buffet, meaning that it appears what the writer is saying is that AH is trying to give the impression of being someone who doesn't watch her weight, or who eats whatever she wants, or eats a lot, or for whatever reason has a strong appetite. But at the same time, what the writer actually observes is that she's drinking a lot of coffee and just barely nibbling on something, right? So anyway, it's interesting. The writer is looking for these little inconsistencies between what's being said and what she's really seeing. Okay, so it says, every so often she breaks off our conversation to ask her friend, Todd, an enigmatic man who partners charities up with celebrities, whether her missing suitcase has been tracked down. After a while, I too began praying for its return. Did you catch that? So basically she's saying that like AH keeps bugging this assistant about her suitcase, and like is bugging him so incessantly about when's the suitcase coming back or when's it getting here, that the writer herself, Leaf, gets sick of this and is like starts praying, oh my God, I hope the suitcase is gonna get here soon so she'll stop talking about it. After a while, I too begin praying for the suitcase's return. Finally, AH decides she needs Todd's belt, which he removes from his trousers without complaint. We all watch, bemused, as she knots the belt around her minuscule waist and stares at herself to see what the effect on her outfit is. Okay. I try to steer us back on track so the writer says, I try to steer us back on track. So what's happened is the writer is that AH is being, for whatever reason, is being so hyperactive and bouncing around and not being focused, and not wanting to focus on what's being asked, and then at one point decides that she needs to like fix her outfit and put on a belt and everything, and the writer keeps trying to get the conversation to go back on track, but it won't. And you know, this kind of reminds me of the video from the deposition where where AH is very hostile and does not want to be deposed and is eating, but also is kind of like sort of eyes darting, looking all around and that sort of thing. I don't know. I try to steer us back on track by asking about the importance of her female network. She says, quote, I'm very much a woman's woman. She believes the patriarchy has forced women into competition, but deep down we are wired to be, quote, connectors, community builders, mothers, sisters, friends. Hollywood fuels female rivalry. I feel it in some actresses and models, and I don't fault them for it. I think they haven't had a woman look them in the eye and say, I'm on your side. I believe in you. She talks about her mother, Paige, who she recently discovered had to resign from her job in technology because of basically being harassed at work. That's what she says here. AH still seems shocked by the revelation, but remains optimistic that women's experiences are finally improving. There has been, quote, a shift in what's happening all around us, not just in attitude, but in the nature of the conversations and the vigor in which we are having them, she says. She sees herself as part of a great global sorority. Quote, I feel that as soon as you get to know me, you know I'm on your side, as a woman. I don't care how you feel I look. Just like you, I struggle with the same iniquities, personal discomfort, insecurities, strengths, and weaknesses as you do. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to point out here. First of all, I've noticed in interviews that AH really likes to refer to her beauty a lot. She likes to refer to it in sort of a, not passive aggressive is, I guess, is not quite the right term, but she wants to do it sort of obliquely, so as if to say, this is not important, but oh, pay attention to it. And so what she likes to say in these interviews is that it's hard for her to get taken seriously because of how beautiful she is, and that also other women feel threatened by her. And so what she's saying here is once women get to know me, then they aren't threatened by how I look, because they see that even with the way that I look, I still have it just as tough as they do. And then she misuses the word iniquities, which I know is not the biggest problem in the world, but because she prides herself so much on her vocabulary, I think she's trying to say inequities, but she says iniquity. Iniquity is sin, actually. So I don't think that's what she meant to say, but I don't know. Okay, so continuing on, she says that she gets nervous when she enters a crowded room and detects a barrage of preconceived notions about her. She worries that her reputation means that she, quote, won't have the opportunity to get to know somebody or let them know that I am who I am. Leaf writes, I witnessed her nerves firsthand on the way to giving her speech. During the car journey, she becomes quieter, preferring to play music she discovered while visiting the Zatari refugee camp in Jordan. When she does talk, it is to tell me about a girl she met there who was terrified at the prospect of having her cleft lip operated on. I am skeptical about the usefulness of glamazon celebs jetting off to deprived places to hold hands with the unfortunate. Did you catch that? So the writer, basically in the middle of AH, again, trying to give her this moving story about this girl that she met in refugee camps who needed a cleft palate operation and a tragedy and all of that. And again, the writer's internal response, as she tells us, is to think, I'm really skeptical of all of these glamazon celebs jetting off here and there to champion these causes. So she's completely like, again, this writer is so subtle, completely like undercutting what's just been said. And then she asks AH, do you ever feel guilty for this? Meaning, like, do you feel like in a way, you're exploiting other people's tragedies, for your own reputation? And so again, this writer's being pretty honest. No, she says, her eyes huge and sincere. Even though I didn't come from a privileged background by American standards, I have had incredible luck, and we are all burdened by it. I don't feel embarrassed about it. Do something about it, is what I would say. The writer says, Leaf writes, I'm not convinced that we've drilled down to the heart of the matter, but directness is not AH's strong suit. She readily admits to being long-winded. Sentences charge bravely into a labyrinth, never to emerge. So, I mean, this writer is not even trying anymore to mask her feelings about AH's communication style. She says that directness is not her strong suit. She's long-winded, and her sentences charge bravely into a labyrinth, like a maze, right? Yeah, I know you know what that is, but into a maze, never to emerge again. Thankfully, she is more focused on stage. In front of a packed auditorium of engaged young people, she gushes about, quote, the importance of our shared humanity. It's a tough gig, coming after many phenomenal speeches, but she just about succeeds in holding the room. Boy, this writer. Because what is this writer really saying? If she says that she just about, her speech just about succeeds in holding the room, meaning that she didn't succeed, right? Throughout the day, I see people hankering after a picture or a look or a kind word from AH. When people recognize her, she says, there are, quote, two kinds of faces they make. There's the selfie face. That's great. I love people appreciating what I do. But it's the other one that she's seeing more of. She beats her heart with her fist, whispering, thank you, thank you. by way of demonstration. Quote, women approach me and bring their sister and best friend, and they say thank you. And I know deep down in my soul what that means. And that's the end of that article. And so, yes, I know that probably a number of you, were hating some of the AH speeches in there and long-windedness, but I think it's worth it to hear some of the things that come out of her mouth, and more interestingly, some of the observations of this writer. Now, in 2020, this writer did a follow-up, and basically it was timed to coincide with the UK trial. And basically, this writer in 2020, Leaf, in this other article that was also paywalled, she's reminiscing about this meeting with AH and providing sort of updated or new impressions on her. And again, I think it's interesting some of the things that she says. All right, so the title of this second article, this came out in July 2020, so this last July, and again, this is by Leif Arbuthnot. Oh, and let me adjust my camera focuses. There we go, a little bit better. Okay, so I will get all this situation improved soon, but I have a job that's really busy right now and probably will not let up for another month and a half. Okay. So the title of this updated article is Who is the Real AH? And then under it says, Johnny Depp is no enigma, but what about his ex? Leif Arbuthnot recalls a peculiar, she writes, peculiar encounter with AH from 2018. Oh, okay, so I'm sorry, I guess the article that I was reading, I'm not going to go back and change everything, but I guess it was 2018, not 2019. But anyway, it doesn't really matter. So she writes, I was cycling, this is Leaf now in 2020, I was cycling past the Royal Courts of Justice 10 days ago when I saw a group of people packed tightly on the pavement. I Googled what was going on. AH had arrived for a trial at High Court where her ex, Johnny Depp, is suing the Sun's publisher and one of its journalists for what he claims is an inaccurate article. Photos of AH entering the courts whisked briskly around the internet. I noticed, with a small shock of recognition, that she was wearing a jumper dress cinched at the waist by a belt, just as she had when I was flown to The Hague in 2018 to interview her for the Sunday Times. In fact, she looked exactly the same. Beautiful and ineffably enigmatic. Now, enigmatic meaning that you just don't know what to make of her. So again, you get that writer's skepticism in here. So the writer talks about what has, basically updating the reader, just briefly, a summary of what has happened since the 2018 article and the trial that's ongoing and so forth. All right. And then she says, it was odd to think of the pair, meaning AH and Johnny Depp, who have been locked in contention, legal contention, for so long in such close proximity to one another. Now, that is an interesting observation. I'm sure that's something that some of you have thought about, too. What must it be like, from Johnny Depp's perspective, or from AH's, if you believe her, but I don't, but what must it be like to sit there sharing the same space, the same breath, basically, with someone that you once loved more than anyone else on earth, maybe except for your children, and that you had done everything for, and now is trying to destroy you? Like, just what must that be like for Johnny Depp? And so anyway, she talks about reasons why people doubt AH's story. And so basically, after Leif provides this update summary, she kind of ends that part on this sort of, I don't know what to think kind of note, where she's basically saying that she's skeptical of both of them. And, I don't agree with that opinion. I think, as a number of you do, that it is actually very one-sided, that AH is clearly in the wrong. But I do appreciate at least that this writer was taking on a really skeptical tone and was trying to present that there was another side of it. It's better than we've gotten from a lot of the media, right? So, Leif writes, I had no idea what to expect when I turned up at The Hague 2 years ago for the original interview, praying that AH would not flake would show up. The interview had been tricky to secure, and I was unsure how much time I would end up getting to spend with her. But eventually, she floated down the hotel staircase. AH was in The Hague to give a speech, and she talks about all of that, okay? I'd been given permission to spend some of the day with her. As she settled onto the sofa, apologizing for being late, I was rather floored by her beauty. And she talks about that for a bit. And then she says, she was keen to establish an immediate intimacy with me that I soon found oppressive as a sewn-up English journalist. I love this. So what she's saying, again, in starker terms, is that it was clear that AH was really trying to win her over and bowl her over with her insights and her compassion and all of that. And the writer says, yeah, it was oppressive. In other words, like, I felt like it was smothering me. It was way too much, especially for this sewn up, buttoned up English journalist. So I really like that. AH touched my hands, holding my gaze intently as she talked about women's rights. Now, she didn't say this in the other article, but I don't think she's making it up. I think now she's giving us a little more insight on how things were a little bit weirder than she indicated in that original article, because she said that at this point, AH is holding her hand. And you have to, again, this stuff can pass by so quickly that you don't appreciate, like, totally the humor in it. But imagine here, like, this woman is basically kind of emotionally pulling away from her in this interaction. She finds it oppressive. It's too much. She's skeptical. I'm sure she was communicating this with her face. And what is AH's response is just to, like, lean in closer and grab her hand and be more intense there. So it's interesting. And I'm sure those of you who want to can make of it what you will. She touched my hands, holding my gaze intently as she talked about women's rights. She allowed her eyes to fill with tears when I mentioned the recent Supreme Court hearings. Her sentences were labyrinthine, like as in a labyrinth, as in a maze, right? Winding all over the place, don't really make sense. Her sentences were labyrinthine and didn't reach the bullseye you hoped they would. I'm sorry, one more time. Her sentences were labyrinthine and didn't reach the bullseye you hoped they would. She never said Depp's name or referred straightforwardly to her marriage, but she did circle around the subject. And so then she talks about, we've already heard this part about, she talks about being, crying on the floor in a puddle and having, all of these psychological symptoms brought on by her experiences in the past with Depp and et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to repeat that. Then this is what the writer says. It wasn't relaxing being in Heard's orbit. She had a jolting way of jumping from one subject or activity to the next. As we chatted, she told me suddenly that she had Band-Aids on her chest because her bra had been lost in transit. When she decided that her dress would look better pinched in, a henchman wordlessly took the belt from his own trousers and gave it to her. I watched mesmerized as she looped it around her minute waist. I know we heard about that, but she describes it a little bit more interestingly here. I spoke to her for about half an hour, then got in her car to go to the conference center. As we drove, she put on Middle Eastern music, so loud I could barely hear myself think. She reminisced about her wild Texan childhood, which she spent driving pickup trucks without a license and riding horses that her father broke in. Eventually, she dropped out of school to make it as a model, then as an actress. She talked at length about a recent trip to a refugee camp where she'd met a girl with a cleft lip. Now, I think that what's funny here so far is that they get in this car for her to drive them to The Hague or whatever, and AH turns up what's described here as Middle Eastern music, and she turns it up so loud that the writer says that she couldn't even hear herself think. And then AH is basically like screaming her story at her in this loud car with this music about her Texas background. It's kind of ridiculous. Anyway, the writer writes, I was struck by her lack of self-awareness. She had no idea that she sounded like a parody of an entitled white actress, jetting off to hold hands with unfortunate kids in problematic countries. Even though, quote, this is AH now. Even though I didn't come from a privileged background by American standards, I have had incredible luck and we are all burdened by it, she told me. I think you heard that. Now the writer writes this. Traipsing around after her all day, snatching minutes alone together, gave me a strong sense of how isolating and damaging fame can be. Wherever AH went, people wanted something from her. One of her million-volt smiles, an autograph, the promise of a future meeting. I had the impression that she was desperate to be seen as more than Depp's ex. She wanted to be taken seriously as an intellectual and an activist. She admitted to me that she got nervous in crowded rooms when she felt the weight of others' quote, preconceived notions. She also seemed to need to link her own experiences with a larger pan-female narrative. Now that's interesting. The writer says that she seems desperate to be taken seriously as an intellectual, to get out of what she perceives as the shadow not only of her experiences and the media coverage of the stuff with Depp, but also of her own beauty, and be taken more seriously. And then it says that, and then the writer says, and this is very insightful, that she seemed to need to link her own personal experiences with a larger pan-female narrative, meaning link her struggles with the larger struggles, supposedly, of women at large. She genuinely thought that she and I had comparable worries and insecurities, but to me, she seemed from another planet. I might have been flattered had I not been perplexed. So that's what this writer says, is she's trying to tell me that we share this struggle, but she seems like she's from another planet. That's the writer's opinion, is like, this lady is from another planet. And she said she was perplexed by her. And then finally, I'm skipping through a bit of this, but finally she writes, at the end of my day with AH, I was left more unsure about who she was than at the start of it. It felt inappropriate, even absurd, to form robust conclusions about what had happened during her marriage, or to decide who was lying and who was the wronged party. So the writer's basically saying, like, it's beyond me to figure this out, but something doesn't feel right with AH. That's what she's saying there. She's like, I don't know, there's these competing claims and so forth, which, if you actually investigate and you listen to the tapes, then we know that it's not hard to figure out. But they give the writer credit, though, for not buying the media narrative, and also for being sharp enough when she's around AH to not be fooled by her. She writes, on the plane back to London, I couldn't quiet my sense of pity. Whoever AH was, she seemed searingly lonely. Last week, she walked to the court, hand arm in arm with a female entourage. I remembered what AH had told me about women, that we are natural connectors. At the time, it sounded like guff. Maybe it is, but whichever way the dust settles on this ugly period, I hope that AH finds solace in the mystical sorority she held so dear when we met. Yeah, so the ending is kind of like, but, oops. But I think that there's some interesting stuff there. And so I didn't have time to include this in part one. So I did want to make a separate little treat for you. I hope that you've enjoyed these two interviews. And if you haven't seen part one, a longer video where I actually break down different video clips and video interviews, people really seem to like that. So take a look. Subscribe to my channel, and of course most of my videos are too controversial for monetization, but I would appreciate any tips. Even $1 is great. And so if you enjoy my videos, it's basically like what you'd pay for a really not so good movie on Amazon. All right, more to come. I'm making a long video in the royal family, and yeah, have a good weekend. Bye.